Here is the one-word secret to academic success and success in life. Vocabulary.
Welcome to Talking About Kids. I am your host, R. Bradley Snyder, researcher, activist, and author of The 5 Simple Truths of Raising Kids. This is part 2 of my conversation with Joe Lockavitch, in which Joe shares his insights on helping students read and his general passion for education. If you have not heard part 1, I recommend navigating to the previous episode now. Like most everything in the education sector, Joe's failure-free reading program has proponents and detractors. Proponents say that they have seen students progress rapidly using the failure-free reading program. Detractors point to a lack of empirical evidence for its effectiveness. According to the Works Clearinghouse, there is a single rigorous evaluation of the failure-free reading program, and it found moderate positive effects on comprehension. Detractors also say that it is not easy to integrate the failure-free reading program into existing curricula. Regarding the latter criticism, I imagine that Joe thinks that that is part of the point, because he is fond of stating that the real enemy of students with chronic reading challenges is the existing instructional approach. This podcast is sponsored in part by the Arizona Department of Health Services Must Stop Bullying campaign through its Title V Maternal and Child Health Program. For more information, go to muststopbullying.org. And now, the interview.
Fortunately, what's happened now is that we've seen a significant technological change.
Okay.
That we can do things now with software when written properly that we couldn't do 3 years ago, 4 years ago. So one of the features that I now have is self-pacing software.
Okay.
There are 11 entry points into my program. We find the reading frustration level of the kids. We start them at the too hard level. The software then introduces the vocabulary, defines the vocabulary, reads that part of it to them. The other things that you find is that there are roadblocks to reading comprehension that I keep on coming back
right.
to. The true enemy for our kids is the text material.
Yeah.
It goes back to that notion of reading is relating. There are roadblocks contained in conventional reading material that our kids can't easily relate to. Now, let me share with you
Please.
what they are.
Yeah.
Uncommon names, dates, and places. Idiomatic expression.
Yep.
Figurative speech.
Yep.
Awkward, a sentence is written in an awkward style. We know that there is a syntactical developmental structure.
Yep.
We know that simple, positive, active, declarative sentences are the easiest unit of understanding. That the more you get into complex, negative, passive, exclamatory sentences, the more confusing. And for your audience, I'll give you an example that I use over and over again, Brad. The man drove the car. The car was driven by the man.
Right.
Now, in terms of deep meaning, is there any difference in the meaning conveyed from the man drove the car as opposed to the car was driven by the man?
There shouldn't be, right? Right.
It's identical in meaning.
Yeah.
That said, which one will be read easier?
Yeah, the first one. I mean, there's
because
parsimony
it's
of
a simple,
words, right?
positive, active, declarative sentence. Okay, so in many ways, you look at the sentence structure and it's too awkward in the beginning for our kids. Like in the example that I gave, it was a passive rather than an active sentence.
Yeah.
You added more words in a more cumbersome manner. You added a prepositional phrase. You did things to convey meaning that just made it harder for our kids because of the way in which the sentence was written. And then the biggest one for our kids, is lack of appropriate repetition. If I could give your audience one critical thing is, and I had a good colleague, good friend of mine at the University of Tennessee. His name was Chuck Hargis, Dr. Chuck, and he wrote books just wonderful. But he did a study in which he looked at one variable, regardless of age. As the literacy level of the client dropped, the need for this one variable proportionately increased. And it was like negative 0.9293. It was unheard of. It was almost a direct correlation. As one goes, the other went up proportionally.
Yeah.
And you know what that was?
From context, I think you're going to say repetition. Yeah.
Repetition. The problem that we have right now is traditional materials are not repetitious enough for our kids. And so what you find, a lot of this is Frida Ebert's work out at the in California, University of California, and in which she states that text does matter in the teaching of reading. And so what she would say is she did a study in terms of repetition. And what she found was in the 40s, 50s, 60s, publishers had generally a rule of thumb. And that rule of thumb was, if you're going to introduce a new word into a story, the rule of thumb is about 20. You would have 20 exposures of that word in that story. So it's 20-1.
Interesting.
You know what that is now?
No, this is fascinating. What is it?
Less than 4.
So,
and in some cases, there are interventions out there that want one-to-one. So the problem that you have is it's simply not repetitious enough for our kids. Now, there's an issue pertaining to repetition.
Yes.
But I'll share with you what the antidote is. The issue is, as you well know, and one of the biggest problems I have is, if you already know how to read, and I show you repetitious material,
this is where I was going.
You don't want to know it because you're bored. And so you can't see the importance of that repetition. So one of the things that I do in my material is I'm based on the notion of MEMC, multiple exposures and multiple contexts. I'm also based on the notion of CR. CR is creative redundancy. How many times can I say the same thing?
But differently.
Now, when I go out and I work with a client or a school district, by the way, I only have 2 million hours of direct instruction. Okay. So again, it comes back to, I ain't blowing smoke here. But if I go to a client, and one of the things the teacher or the parent would say, I'd say, how they doing? And they say, well, they don't like it. Well, why don't they like it? Well, they're bored by it. They just say it's just too boring. I said, well, I agree. And they said, well, what do you mean you agree? And I said, well, if they're bored, then what it means is that you've got them at too easy a level. And so let me share with you what we're going to do. We're going to bump them up at least 1 or 2 grade levels higher. We're going to get them to where traditional materials would call frustration level, where they're scoring well below 20, 30, 40% on what we're about to teach.
Okay.
I call it challenge level.
Okay.
We're going to get them to the point where they say, this is too hard, I can't do it.
Okay.
Because when they're at challenge level, this amount of repetition, this amount of multiple exposures, multiple contexts is not boring. It's the mother of learning.
Right. Right.
I see your eyes going. So
No,
I think I'm intriguing.
No, this is, I'm putting this all in context, with so much of this field, Dr. Joe, there have been other people using different nomenclature. So at any given time when I'm taking in new information, I'm putting it through the Rosetta Stone of my experience and what I've read and what I've studied. And you've already done like this fascinating job. I was already loaded up to ask you some questions that you answered before I could. So I really appreciate that. And that boredom question, that was a big deal from my experience as a school counselor. As a school counselor, I had the kids with the lowest test scores and the kids with the highest test scores. The kids with
That's
the lowest
right.
scores were the ones you described earlier. They were frustrated. And the kids with the highest test scores were bored. And both of them
And let me
were
share
right.
with you something that I could talk to you forever, and I don't mean to cut you off because you go into you've gone on two key points.
Right.
My work, what I've developed is really not an intervention. It is a reading acceleration program.
Okay.
And when you look at the bell-shaped curve, what you're really looking at, the biggest population is in the meat
Right.
is in one standard deviation plus or minus. That's 67% of the thing. That's where schools excel.
Right.
Schools do great. Where they get beat up is when you go this way.
Right.
When you go either to the 1, 2 to 3 standard deviations to the left or to the right. So what you have is you've got kids who are chronically failing.
Right.
And so they're testing at the bottom of the bottom. Or you've got kids who are chronically bored.
Yep.
Because they're testing at the top of the top.
And both of them in that, 33% of the population are taking 80% of the school's resources and teachers' times because of those two things that we've talked about, right?
Yes.
And
Yes.
often manifesting
And
in
when you go back
behaviors.
into that, if you
Right.
go one standard deviation in there,
Yeah.
most of those interventions are working. Where you really get it is when they're 1.5 to 2 or 3 standard deviations either way. Those are my kids. Okay. Those are the kids I'm talking about. I'm talking about kids with IQs as low as 40, 45, who have never read a day in their life and now are reading cognitively appropriate passages, many for the first time in their life. And I'm also talking about, one of my next books or one of my next topics is how to prepare your preschooler for the SAT.
Yeah. I saw that you were working on that. Yeah.
And the reason why is when my first child was born, Tess, I'm going to give you and your audience a one-word secret to academic success and success in life. And if they do nothing but listen to me, and by the way, I'm going to get passionate in a little while. Right now, I'm just laid back. Here is the one-word secret to academic success and success in life. You ready, Brad?
I'm ready.
Vocabulary.
Right.
No student can read above their language level of comprehension.
Right.
Elevate their vocabulary, and you will elevate their comprehension. The other is that we are a highly oral society. Right. Individuals are judged the moment they open up their mouth. Now, one more thing I want to get to
Well,
touch.
let me build on what you just said there real quick there, because we also the other importance of this vocabulary is the vocabulary is the language of creativity. So it's not just that you're comprehending more, but there's wonderful studies that show that the amount of thoughts you're able to have is dictated by your vocabulary. More
Oh,
words you
absolutely.
know, the more creative, the more your ideas can be.
It's opportunity.
Yeah,
Let me give you here. Let's. You want to talk about creativity and imagination?
yeah,
Wouldn't it be great? We're in our whole world is based on assessment. Assess
right,
this,
right.
assess that, predict this, predict that. I'm not going down that path.
Okay,
Other than, wouldn't it be nice though if we were going to assess it? Wouldn't it be nice if that we could give a universal assessment instrument, and when we're done, the thing will say, well, this person scored high enough that they're going to be the CEO of a company, and this one will be a manager, and this one will be a worker, and this one will be a custodian, and
right.
so on. I mean, that'd be kind of cool. Are you ready for this, Brad?
Okay,
That test was developed in
yeah.
1941.
Well,
And you
yeah.
know what it was? Thompson did it, and it was a vocabulary
Yeah,
test. He took critical vocabulary and gave it to
right.
CEOs, executive managers, and guess what he found?
Yeah,
Those with the strongest vocabulary did the best
the
in
best.
life. And so in my program and the pilot that we're doing in North Carolina,
Yeah,
a lot of people think it's a reading intervention. It's not. It is a highly structured language development program. It's a vocabulary program.
right.
How can you ask a sixth grader to read at a sixth grade level when they're sitting in that classroom with the third grade vocabulary?
Yeah,
And the problem that you have is exposure. A lot of it is right now we've got large numbers of kids that are coming into the United States. They can't relate to the content because they can't relate to the language
right,
because they don't have the culture to
right.
yet. So you have to be able to present material that they can relate to. You also have kids who are uh,
Well, you when
yeah,
you mentioned it, that
go
was
on.
the other. I mean, when I was talking about buttons that you're pushing of mine, you're finding that too much of the reading materials in classrooms contain idioms and references that are too narrow. Well, that's also that's bias, right? And so we're introducing bias in that sense too. So something that we've known for a long time is that a lot of the standardized tests, we're getting a little bit better at it in a society. They were biased towards one world experience. You did better on them if this is the experience you had in this country. If you hadn't had that experience in this country, you're going to do poorly simply because you
You
didn't
couldn't
have that
relate to it.
experience. You couldn't relate to it. You didn't know the
You
idioms.
couldn't
You didn't
relate.
know exactly. I haven't
And it had nothing and but sadly they were judged on that.
absolutely.
And then when you get into this notion of differentiated grading,
Yeah,
the assumption is, well, if the kid can't read independently passages written at a first or second grade level, then the kid can't work any higher, so we're going to just keep them at this level, when in many cases
right.
they could work 4 5 6 7 levels higher if we just changed the way
Right.
we presented the damn material to them,
No,
and we presented it in a way that they could relate to it.
I've
The kid
been
didn't
yeah.
know the word acquaintance, couldn't sound the word acquaintance out, but he sure as hell knew
Knew what
what a
it
friend
meant.
was.
So I've been listening to you talk about the presentation of the material, and a question that remains for me is this idea of what is comprehension? Because too often, what I think we are measuring is recall. And I think that's a very different thing. Am I wrong?
Yes, you're absolutely correct.
Okay.
Excuse me. No, you're not wrong. Yes, you are correct. I apologize. Um, in many ways, you're looking at literal comprehension, and then you're looking at what they call it close reading.
Yeah.
And in close reading, you're putting it you're reading passages based on what makes the most sense.
Right. So
What
how do we get around that? Because I think most educators would agree that what they want to know if somebody reads a passage is whether or not the student can tell the story that was contained in that passage. What was it about? Instead, the easy tests that come with too many textbooks, the ones that you can download, are asking for a person's name out of that. They're
yeah,
asking for, where did this take place? Which
yeah.
might be important, but it might not tell you anything about what the passage was about that you can remember that factoid from it. How do you then assess comprehension so you're not just
It's the
measuring
way in which
recall?
you present. You again, we go back to. I keep on coming back to reading is related.
Right,
What you have to make sure, and I want parents to understand this too. Um, and we go back to those. We go back to the roadblocks to comprehension.
right,
So once you know roadblocks to comprehension, for example, if you're asking your child to read he's 14 years old, and you ask him to read a story, and it's got awkward terms, uncommon name states and
right.
places, it's written in a crazy way. You can almost you can almost predict before they even open up their mouth where they're going to break down because
Right,
it's not a comprehensible test
right,
text, not test. See, my whole research is based on the notion of creating material that is written in the most comprehensible form, so I control for those
right,
variables. I don't and when I do control for those variables, all of a sudden the kids can relate to
right.
the content because there aren't issues pertaining to that. So when if I'm a
And
parent,
just to be clear though, because I want to make sure my listeners understand this, because if I'm following along with you, you're not talking about making it most comprehensible because you're limiting the vocabulary. You're looking at how
no,
the
I'm
sentences
expanding.
are structured so that that the structure of the sentence and the text is presented in the clearest way using
Yeah,
vocabulary that's growing and advancing.
let me give you an example.
Yeah,
Okay, you've got a couple of things. Number one of the biggest problems that we have in many ways, if you follow this notion that the enemy is the text,
yes,
all too often, what you have is a situation where we're using the text to present new material to kids.
right,
And whether it's 6, 16, 66, I don't care what it is. The notion is the kid goes into the classroom and he's told to read the passage, and tomorrow you have a test on it or whatever it
right,
is. My research, is in many ways, that's the worst thing that you can do. That you don't use a textbook to introduce new content, that you use a textbook to reinforce content that you've introduced prior to that.
got it. Right,
So if I'm a parent and my kid's having difficulty in social studies, my first assumption is it ain't my kid.
right.
My assumption is it's that damn book, and that kid doesn't understand that book, and he doesn't understand
Yeah,
things in that.
yeah,
So, as a parent, what I would like, because I want my kid to be successful, is I would ask the classroom teacher, can I have the assignments for next week?
right,
Do I have your permission to read this material to them at home?
right,
Then we can go over the terminology. We can go over the passage. Then I can ask questions like, well, what do you think that means?
right.
What? Now listen how they wrote this. And then after they've had at least one introductory lesson, then all of a sudden you're going to see changes in that classroom
Right.
in terms of their performance. Is this helpful?
Oh, it's 100% helpful, and I think that there were wonderful tips in what you just said. Um, I want to talk about one last topic here, and that is the importance of third grade reading scores. And again, this is, I'm going to tell you my bias here right now,
Okay, fair enough.
which is, I recognize that there was some really interesting quantitative work done that showed that the third grade reading score was a predictor of high school completion. I understand that. What people did with that data, I disagree with entirely. And what they did is they put the emphasis on getting a really good reading score in third grade without paying attention to what the score was measured of or what that reading score was actually computing, right? So it wasn't that, hey, if we can get more, third graders to read better, they're going to graduate. That third grade reading score was a measure of so much more about that child's life and environment than whether or not they could pass that test. So and then the other thing that happened as a result of that is we pushed to get that third grade reading score up. And then after third grade, we said, well, we got them to that finish line. They're going to be fine after that. Or if they didn't do well at third grade, oops, here's somebody that we can give up on now. I don't know if this is too off topic for you, Dr. Joe, but what's your thought about how much we should be focused on reading in third grade versus in fourth grade versus in fifth grade versus in kindergarten?
We're on the same page.
Okay.
So you're preaching to the choir.
Okay.
I think that I've had this argument significantly,
right?
Because it has had some really, really significant pieces of legislation in states across the country, based on third grade scores. Now, I do believe that you have to have some measure of how the kid's doing.
Absolutely.
But to me, to retain a student at the end of third grade, it violates every fiber of my being. And I can share with you that the research is, regardless what they're saying, and by the way, Frida Ebert's work, I'll send you a link to an article that touches that.
Right.
Because one of the things that she said is that these kids right now, kids in second and third grade right now, are reading content that is significantly more sophisticated and more advanced than what we showed them even 10 or 20 years ago. So we're basing legislation on thoughts that we had that really is not accurate. We're not giving the kids enough credit. The other is there's a social construct that goes with this, and that is, when I retain a third grader, I don't give a damn what I do after that. I've increased by a factor of 214% that kid's going to drop out of school at age 16. Now, that to me is blaming the victim. And then the assumption is that we're using a measuring instrument that is infallible, and a measuring instrument that if the kid doesn't do well on this test or the way in which, we're going to give them more of the same, rather than Here's my best analogy, and I know I'm getting long-winded, but
we're great.
What I think about this. Imagine that you're in New York City, Brad.
Yes.
And you're crossing the street, and you're jaywalking or whatever, but you're crossing the street and you get hit by a car.
Right.
Now you are lying down in the middle of that road, and you are really in bad shape.
Right.
But in the distance, you hear the faint sound of a siren, and that siren's getting louder and louder and louder, and you say, oh, thank God, the ambulance is coming. The ambulance is coming. Help is on the way.
Right.
And as soon as they get there, you ready for this? the ambulance driver drives over you a couple of times to tell you why were you stupid enough to go out into that road. In other words, you're blaming the victim.
Right. We've just spent a wonderful time together. I want to thank you so much, obviously for being a guest, but I want to thank you for your passion around this topic. I know that it's going to resonate with my listeners, and it's going to inspire them to do what I suspect are many things they already believed.
This is what I love to do.
Yeah.
And before I go, I want your audience to know this. Number one, it's never too late.
Thank you.
Never give up. Your kid is not the problem. Your child can do faster, they can do higher, they can do more.
That was part 2 of my interview with Joe Lockavitch. For more information about Joe and the failure-free reading program, please visit talkingaboutkids.com. From there, you also can find out about upcoming episodes, suggest a topic, learn more about me and my books, or submit your questions for future guests. Our theme song is by The Senators. For more of their music, go to thesenatorsmusic.com. And remember, kids are young goats and young humans, and the difference is that young goats are easier to manage.